Helen had always valued her privacy and kept things low-key. On that particular morning in Los Angeles, she dressed in a simple way, grabbed her old Honda keys, and left for her job at the local library. The sky was bright and clear, promising an ordinary day ahead, but she couldn't shake the subtle feeling that something was a little off. Maybe it was just nerves about a busy day, or maybe, deep down, she sensed that fate was cooking up a surprise. As Helen made her way through the familiar streets, she listened to the radio and let her mind wander. But then she noticed a police car following her several cars back. At first, she thought nothing of it. Police cars were a common sight in the city. Still, the way this one trailed behind her, keeping a careful distance but not turning away, made her grip the steering wheel a little tighter. She tried to steady her breathing and focused on the road. Doing everything by the book, she used her blinker and pulled over by a gas station. She had done nothing wrong, just a standard stop, or so she thought. She had no idea that this ordinary morning was about to turn her life completely upside down. Officer Jay Collins, a young cop known for his pushy attitude and quick temper, walked up to Helen's car. His footsteps were heavy and firm, and even from inside her car, Helen could feel his impatience. He barely glanced at her before raising his voice and demanding her license and registration. There was no hello, no explanation for why she was being stopped. Just orders, as if she were nothing but a problem to deal with. Helen tried her best to keep things steady. She took a deep breath, announcing each movement as she carefully reached for her wallet and then slowly pulled her document from her bag. She remembered reading somewhere that it was safer to narrate everything, so there would be no surprises. Even as Officer Collins watched her with clear suspicion, she kept her hands visible and her tone calm. But the more patience Helen showed, the more agitated Jake seemed to become. Without explanation or warning, he yanked open her door and barked at her to get out of the vehicle. Helen's heart raced, but she did as she was told, moving slowly so he could see she wasn't a threat. The clerk inside the station and a couple at the pumps seemed to freeze, watching the scene unfold, nobody daring to speak or move, as if the whole world was waiting to see what would happen next. The moment Helen's feet touched the pavement, everything changed. Out of nowhere, Officer Collins landed a sharp slap across her face. The sound was sudden and loud, echoing through the gas station like a warning. Helen staggered, more from shock than the force itself, her cheek burning hot as fire. There was a split second when everything seemed to freeze. No one moved. Even the distant traffic faded away. Then the pain settled in. But it was not just pain. It was the public humiliation, the sense of vulnerability in front of total strangers. For a moment, Helen fought to keep her balance. She refused to give in or allow tears to fall. She tasted blood in her mouth but pressed her lips together, standing tall despite the sting in both her cheek and pride. Around her, people started gathering. She saw, through blurred vision, a woman lifting her phone to record, while a teenager whispered something to the man beside him. The initial shock in the air vanished, replaced by a swirl of murmurs, whispers, and angry gasps. Someone muttered about calling a lawyer. Nobody had expected things to get so intense so fast. Suddenly, Helen wasn't just a woman pulled over. She became the center of a moment nobody would soon forget. Helen kept her back straight, refusing to show any weakness, even though her cheek pulsed with pain and her mind spun with the shock of it all. With a deliberate movement, she reached into the pocket of her navy blazer. The crowd's eyes followed her hand, curious and tense. Slowly, she pulled out a shiny gold badge, her official proof that she was a federal judge. The sunlight caught on the badge's surface, reflecting off the engraved seal of the United States District Court, and for a second, it was almost as if everything around her faded. Officer Collins's face drained of color. His arrogance seemed to crack and fall away, replaced by the unmistakable look of someone who suddenly realized just how badly he had crossed the line. People in the crowd noticed the badge, and their anger grew even more intense. Someone began shouting, telling the officer to back off, while another person dialed 911 and loudly explained what had just happened to the dispatcher. Voices overlapped, and Helen could feel the weight of the moment, knowing she had somehow become the voice for everyone who had ever been mistreated by someone in uniform but did not have a badge to defend them. She stood quietly, badge in hand, feeling both exposed and unexpectedly strong, as the world seemed to turn its eyes toward her. Officer Collins hesitated, his hand shaking just above the holster at his side. For a moment, it looked like he was deciding what to do next, but the crowd stood their ground, phones out and recording every second. The attention was too much for him. He knew any wrong move would be all over the news by lunchtime. He glanced at a teenager who boldly kept his phone up, filming. Collins barked at him to stop, but the kid didn't even flinch. People shuffled closer, their faces set with a kind of solidarity that didn't break under pressure. There was something about seeing so many stand together that changed the mood, making it clear that no one would turn away or pretend not to notice. Helen drew in a steady breath. Speaking just loud enough for everyone to hear, she calmly stated she had been assaulted by a public official in front of dozens of witnesses. Collins's confidence crumbled. He stepped back, looking down and avoiding everyone's eyes. He looked smaller now, almost like a completely different person from the officer who had approached her just moments earlier. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the quiet buzz of the crowd waiting, hoping that this time, real justice might finally be served. The sudden arrival of 2 more patrol cars brought an uneasy energy to the scene. Officers Mark Henderson and Lisa Roberts got out fast, each taking in the crowd, the phones, and Helen standing steady in the center. They seemed caught between duty and surprise, eyes wide and alert, quietly sizing everything up. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Helen broke the silence, her voice as clear and calm as ever. She gave her full name, explained she was a federal judge, and described exactly what had happened, from the aggressive stop right down to the slap in front of everyone. Her words carried a weight that was hard to miss, and the crowd listened closely, nodding along. Helen held up her gold badge again, making sure the new officers got a good look. Henderson and Roberts quickly realized this was no ordinary traffic dispute. Their faces changed, and they both straightened up, suddenly careful and respectful. Before they could even ask, the manager of the gas station hurried out, waving his arms. He declared that every moment, from the initial stop onward, had been recorded on the station's security cameras. There would be no confusion or second-guessing. Every detail was on film, 100% undeniable. The crowd seemed to grow quieter, waiting for how the truth would play out. As Officer Collins was led away by Henderson and Roberts, his whole attitude fell apart. His shoulders slumped, and his face lost the last traces of stubbornness. You could see right then he was scared and had nothing left to say. The crowd followed this quietly, but the energy around the gas station felt even stronger. Lisa Roberts tried to get people to step back, but the anger in the air would not disappear. People called out for answers, arguing that what had happened should not be brushed aside this time. Suddenly, the police radio crackled with fresh news. The dispatcher announced that Captain Judith Price, a high-ranking officer in the city, was on her way and would be there any minute. That made the crowd buzz a little louder, some whispering that maybe things would finally be taken seriously. Helen stood straight, refusing any suggestion to leave. Even when someone offered her a chair under the station canopy, she just shook her head. The bruise from Collins's slap was getting darker, but she was not hiding it. Helen's will seemed unbreakable. She was waiting so everything would be told face to face and nothing swept under the rug. The minutes crept by, each one heavier as everyone remembered why they were waiting. When Captain Judith Price finally arrived, it felt like a wave of power had entered the atmosphere. She stepped out of her car and walked right through the crowd without slowing down, her eyes locked on Helen. People parted to let her pass. Her presence let everyone know she was the one in charge now. When Judith stopped in front of Helen, her first words were not bureaucratic. They were gentle, asking if Helen was all right and if she needed anything. For a second, the usual noise from onlookers disappeared as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Helen gave a calm, clear account of everything that had happened. Her voice did not waver. even when she pointed out details about Collins's behavior and the slap that left her cheek swollen. Judith listened closely, nodding when needed, jotting down brief notes. Then the captain's expression changed. She turned around and marched over to where Collins was standing, his posture crumbling further under her gaze. In front of everyone, Judith demanded an explanation from him. Collins stammered a weak story about following protocol, but you could hear the emptiness in his words, especially with the security camera footage, witness videos, and the crowd listening. No one believed his excuses. There would be no more room for stories. Captain Judith Price stood firm in front of Officer Collins, her tone unyielding as she spoke. Without raising her voice, she ordered him to hand over both his service weapon and his badge right there in front of everyone. You could sense the weight of the moment as the whole station seemed to freeze. For a few seconds, all that could be heard was the soft rattle of Collins unsnapping his holster and the solid, metallic clink as he placed his gun and then his badge into Judith's open palm. There was nothing theatrical about it. The finality of that motion was enough. Everyone watching knew something important had just shifted. Helen watched all of this unfold, but there was no pleasure on her face, only a deep disappointment that things had to come to this at all. She did not look at Collins with triumph, because she would have much rather lived in a world where none of this had happened. Officer Roberts stepped quietly behind Collins and, after a short nod from Captain Price, led him away without a word or any kind of struggle. Phone stayed up, capturing every second as people whispered that maybe this time real accountability would follow. The crowd could sense justice starting to take root, though everyone knew this was only the beginning. When the paramedics finally arrived, Helen allowed them to check her face and jot down notes about the bruise. She knew it was necessary, not just for herself, but because every step needed to be official. By now, what had started as a quiet stop at a corner gas station in downtown Chicago had turned into a full-on media event. Reporters with microphones and camera crews were everywhere, circling the crowd to ask questions or catch reactions. The story had already made it to big networks, and people all across Illinois were hearing about it as unfolding news. While Helen sat on the back of an ambulance, a few strangers came over to check on her. Some just placed a comforting hand on her shoulder or nodded their support without saying much. One stood out, a young mechanic from a nearby repair shop, oil still on his knuckles, who leaned in to show Helen the video he had recorded of the incident. His phone screen shook a little with nerves, but the footage was clear. Helen thanked him with a tired smile, understanding that these moments of people looking out for each other meant everything. The crowd's quiet encouragement made it clear the fight for fairness was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who had stood up that day. Inside the police station, Helen sat alone in a plain, windowless room, the fluorescent lights humming above her. She wrapped her arms around her chest for warmth, but it did little to steady her nerves. Just outside the door, there was a constant mix of hurried footsteps, phones ringing, and the voices of officers raised as they tried to handle the flood of calls coming in. The soreness in her cheek was just background noise now. She was more concerned about the responsibilities piling up on her shoulders. This was bigger than personal pain. Every word, every detail in her statement mattered. A little while later, the door creaked open and Captain Judith Price stepped in, bringing with her a sense of gravity. She explained that the incident at the gas station had reached both the State Attorney General's office and the Chicago Civil Rights Commission. Their top people wanted updates, and plenty of officials were already asking pointed questions. Judith assured Helen that a full and thorough investigation would start immediately, but she also admitted the pressure was mounting by the hour. Helen understood. This was the sort of case that could not be buried or ignored. She looked at Judith and promised to cooperate, ready to do whatever it took to see things through. The aftermath came fast. By that same evening, video clips from the gas station were everywhere, on phones, news apps, and even splashed across local TV reports. Headlines ran pictures of Helen's injured face, and the talk shows debated what it meant for Chicago and the whole state. Civil rights groups were quick to call for answers, pushing authorities not to let this be just another story that faded by morning. Helen saw news feeds fill up with every piece of evidence, including several photos of Officer Collins in handcuffs being led through the side entrance of the station. The department moved quickly. Collins was suspended without pay while the investigation played out. Those images started a huge wave of responses. Some people said it was about time police faced consequences. Others were angry to see an officer shamed in public, no matter what the accusation was. Through all of it, Helen felt almost numb. Strangers sent her messages, and her name became a rallying point, but none of that fixed what happened in those awful minutes back at the gas station. Instead of relief, she just kept thinking about everyone else who had been unheard, folks without witnesses whose stories never made it to anyone's screen. With each new headline, Helen was reminded again that the fight for justice was far from over. When Helen stepped out of the station, she was taken aback to find a quiet crowd gathered outside. Dozens of people lined the sidewalk in front of the precinct, each person holding a small white candle or a homemade sign with words like, "We stand with you," and "Justice for all." There were neighbors she recognized and plenty of strangers too, standing shoulder to shoulder, letting the candlelight do the talking. The city's usual noise felt muted in that moment. As Helen made her way down the steps, a teenage girl broke away from the group and hurried over, a little nervous but determined. She thanked Helen for her courage, telling her that seeing someone stand up made her believe things really could change. The sincerity in the girl's voice hit Helen hard. She felt moved in a way she hadn't expected, understanding right then how her struggle was already bigger than just her. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Helen sat at her kitchen table with the candles from the vigil still flickering in her mind. She realized she had never wanted any of this attention. She had never asked to be anybody's symbol. But life had handed her that responsibility. Now, the hardest work will be finding a way to turn all the frustration and sadness into something meaningful for others. The next morning, Helen woke to the sound of her phone buzzing nonstop. As soon as she turned on the television, her own face was there on every local and national news channel. The anchors discussed the case with panels of commentators, and talk shows brought in guests to argue about what had happened to the gas station. Calls flooded into radio stations, some people voicing strong support, while others tried to defend Officer Collins, blaming stress or claiming misunderstandings. The country seemed split over her story, but what overwhelmed Helen most were the dozens and dozens of messages pouring in from people she did not know, emails, texts, and even handwritten letters slipped under her apartment door. Folks from as far away as California and as close as her own block wrote to say they believed in her and were grateful for her bravery. Right in the middle of all this, her old college friend Monica Evans called. Helen had not heard from Monica in years, but the warmth in her voice broke through the noise. Monica's concern and outrage were clear, but so was her determination to help however she could. As Helen listened, she started to feel, maybe for the first time, that she was not just at the center of a storm. She was bringing people together. That small spark of hope made the challenges ahead feel just a little bit lighter. As peaceful protests began to gather outside the courthouse, Helen watched the whole thing unfold from her living room, glued to both her TV and her phone. She scrolled through social media posts and news updates, taking in a mix of support and criticism that flooded every comment section. One moment would lift her up, the next would sting, but she tried to hold onto the voices that believed in her. The live broadcast showed a crowd with banners and plenty of determined faces. Helen felt a surge of emotion when an elderly woman took the microphone and spoke. Her voice was shaky but strong as she told everyone that real dignity should have nothing to do with your job title or how much money you make. It was a reminder of something basic and true, a message that hit home for everyone, including Helen. Word soon spread that Officer Collins had brought in a well-known attorney, someone famous for getting clients out of tight spots. The talking heads on news shows traded theories about what tricks the defense team might use, but most seemed to agree the evidence was overwhelming. There were just too many witnesses and too much video for the story to be blurred or brushed aside. You could almost feel a shift in the country, a sense people were done with excuses, wanting something real to come out of all this. To make sure Helen stayed safe, the police assigned 2 detectives to watch over her around the clock. One of them, Detective Samuel Brooks, was especially attentive, quiet, but always present, checking the locks, screening calls, and even scouting the street outside her building. Just having them there made a difference for Helen. For the first time since everything began, she felt a little lighter, trusting that she no longer had to handle every risk on her own. It was a comfort, a simple relief that let her sleep for more than a couple hours at a stretch. Behind closed doors, things were moving fast. Lawyers met late into the night. Files grew thick with statements and video evidence, and the paperwork seemed endless. Helen stayed in touch with Captain Price, who could point her updated but never sugar-coated things. What had started as a single confrontation at a Chicago gas station was turning into something bigger than anyone first realized. News crews from all across the United States set up outside the courthouse, ready to cover every day of the upcoming trial. As Helen watched all these preparations, she understood that her story had shifted. It was no longer just her battle. Now, it was a stand for something much larger, with everyone watching to see what the future would bring. On the day of the trial, the courthouse buzzed with nervous energy. Every seat in the main courtroom was taken, and the gallery filled with reporters, local politicians, and concerned citizens who had followed the case since day one. Helen, now sitting as a witness, found herself at the front beside two members of the state's judicial committee. She gripped the edge of her chair, steadying herself with long breaths each time another camera flashed. Across the aisle, Officer Collins seemed almost unrecognizable, his broad shoulders slumped and his gaze fixed on the floor. Whatever bravado once filled his courtroom entrances was gone, replaced by a heavy air of regret that seemed to weigh him down more than the suit he wore. Presiding over the case was Judge Olivia Parker, a figure known throughout Illinois for her firmness and integrity. She moved through the day with patience and authority, not letting any drama steer the session off course. Piece by piece, the evidence unfolded. Clear video footage from the station's security cameras, detailed eyewitness statements, and finally, Helen's own calm, unwavering testimony. Helen described everything honestly, leaving out nothing and never once being dramatic. The room hung on her words when she explained how someone's bias left her feeling less than human. Not a sound could be heard as she spoke. The defense attorney tried to flip the story, arguing that Officer Collins acted out of fear rather than prejudice. He leaned into his client's long years in the police force, saying stress and uncertainty pushed him to make a split-second decision. But Judge Parker was not having any of it. She cut off long-winded speeches and told everyone to stick to the evidence. There would be no room for what-ifs or emotional diversions. Only the facts mattered now, and the facts were crystal clear. Every detail had been laid out from multiple angles. The videos, the statements, and Helen's honest account all showed the truth, and there was nowhere left to hide. When it came time for the verdict, everyone in the courtroom held their breath. The jury did not take long to reach a decision. Collins was found guilty of assault, abuse of power, and violating civil rights. Helen felt something heavy lift off her shoulders as the sentence was read aloud. As she left the courthouse, a few quiet cheers and polite applause followed her down the steps. She knew this outcome did not fix everything, but it was a start. Justice had been served in one case, and Helen understood deeply that it would take much more work to turn this moment into lasting change for everyone. Standing before a cluster of reporters at the courthouse steps, Helen kept her statement short but meaningful. She looked right at the rows of cameras and thanked everyone who had stood by her since the very beginning. Family, friends, and total strangers who sent kind messages or showed up to march. Helen's voice was steady as she reminded everyone that justice should never be the privilege of only a few. It needed to be something everybody could count on, no matter where they came from or how much money they had. She urged those watching not to turn away when things seemed unfair and not to stay quiet when it mattered most. Once she finished, there was a quiet pause, and then an energy spread through the crowd. Her words hit home, and you could see it on people's faces. There was hope, but also a push to do better. Later that evening, Helen was out on her small balcony with a cup of tea, just taking in the city when her phone buzzed. The message came from a young woman she did not know, saying she was inspired to go to law school because of Helen's story. That simple note brought an honest smile and a feeling that, even though Helen never chose this fight, she had started something that just might grow. A few weeks later, Helen climbed the broad steps outside the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. The city felt different that morning, as if time had slowed just a bit. She had been invited to a quiet ceremony. Not a big event with flashing cameras, but a small gathering to honor her courage through those tough months. Inside, the crowd was a mix of high school students, local community leaders, and families who brought their kids along, maybe hoping they would see what strength looked like up close. When it came time to speak, Helen walked up to the podium feeling a strange mix of nerves and calm, then talked plainly about what justice really means. She told them it is not just about laws or verdicts in a courtroom, but about everyday moments where people choose to treat each other with dignity and honesty. Her words landed softly, yet stuck with everyone who was listening. After the speeches and a few quiet handshakes, Helen stepped outside and made her way, alone, to her car waiting around the corner. She was not weighed down by loneliness this time. Walking through the cool morning air, she could feel deep down that she was part of something bigger than herself. Others would pick up where she left off, choosing courage and dignity, step by step, just as she had learned to do.